Man, I don't know about you, but the realizing from last week that the road to being a conduit God can use is difficult and that it's narrow and that only a few find it and go down it, man, that was eye opening for me. But I also hope that you chose to be up for the challenge, to be a fully open conduit for God that He can fully use to let His resources flow to you and through you. It kind of makes me remember what God says about Ephesians, what He says in Ephesians 3:20, where it says that He will do more than you think or imagine, and that's what will happen as you open yourself up to being a conduit for Him. You know, this journey to being a conduit's much like the kids' board game, Shoots and Ladders. Really simple game when you think about it. Just got a board game with one of those spinning things that shows how many steps you're supposed to take, and you spin the arrow, and it tells you how many steps to go. And if you get the right number of spaces, you'll land on the bottom of a ladder. And at the ladder, you get to climb up further up the board game. Or, unfortunately, if you land on one of the tops of a chute or a slide, you slide all the way down to the end of that slide. And of course, the whole goal of that game is to be the first one to finish, to get from start to the end. Um, what few people don't know about that board game is that there's actually characters along the board game on each space, and when you get to the bottom of a ladder, what it shows is it shows someone doing something good, and then you go up to the ladder and they finished what they're doing. Or if you see the chute or the slide, when they're at the top of the slide, they're doing something bad, and they slide down and they've done something bad. And I know life is no board game for you and me, but maybe Shoots and Ladders shows us a little bit about that process of becoming a conduit that God can use. So often, many of us, what we do is we actually use this idea of being a conduit for God and look at it and go, and instead of taking that narrow, difficult road, maybe we can take a shortcut. But you know, when we take a shortcut, that shortcut will always short circuit the way that God wants to use us as conduits. I think Moses is a good example of this. Moses, who was chosen to be God's conduit for freedom for his people who were enslaved in Egypt, decided to take a shortcut to being the conduit that God wanted him to be. Let me read what happens in Moses' life in Exodus chapter 2. I believe it's verse 12 and 13. You see, Moses was a prince of Egypt. He had grown up in the the kingdom of Egypt, and in Egypt, in the palace, he was living the life of luxury. But he discovered he was one of them. He was born a Hebrew slave, and so he wanted to help bring freedom, but he didn't do it God's way. He did it his way, and that's how he short-circuited what God wanted him to do. Let me read those verses to you in Exodus chapter 2. It says, actually verse 11, many years later, when Moses had grown up, he went out to visit his own people, the Hebrews, and he saw how hard they were forced to work. During his visit, he saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews. And then verse 12 says, after looking in all directions to make sure no one was watching, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid the body in the sand. Here it says, after looking in all directions. What's interesting, there's actually a translation that says, after looking both ways, he killed the Egyptian. So I got to tell you, there's only one time when looking both ways is probably a good thing, and that's when you're crossing the street. Because if you have to look both ways before you do something, you probably shouldn't do it. In fact, it's probably a shortcut to the way that God wants you to be used for Him. And that's what happens. Moses doesn't do it right. The next time he tries to help someone, someone says, well, we heard about you killing this Egyptian slave master. And then we hear that Pharaoh wants to kill Moses. So Moses flees. And Moses has the ultimate slide down a chute. The ultimate slide was a 40-year slide. For 40 years, he is in the wilderness, and he is a shepherd. He is taking care of, he gets married, and he's taking care of his father-in-law's sheep. And as he has gone down this slide because of the shortcut that he took, what I love is that God wasn't done with him yet. God still wanted to do something through Moses' life. So we read later on, just a few verses later, but 40 years later, of Moses making his way up the mountain because he sees a bush that is burning, but is not burning up. And it is there at that burning bush where God says to Moses, I still want to use you. God could use Moses because Moses, though he had that massive slide of 40 years, he chose to climb up the mountain to meet God. And you know what's amazing is it took Moses 40 years of sliding to get to the point where God would use him again. But God would use Moses in less time than it took for him to slide. It was a massive climb up the ladder, so to speak, like chutes and ladders. He would become the conduit for Israel's freedom from Egypt. It's because he chose not to give up on what God had him to do, even though he had a massive slide. You and I must not give up, even when we have massive slides. You know, in our Christian world, we would call when someone takes a shortcut and it falls apart and doesn't work for them, and they go off in the wrong direction, we'll call that backsliding. Much like chutes and ladders, we call it backsliding, that someone has fallen away from God. And so often in our Christian world, we think that backsliding means that there's no hope for someone, but it's just not true. The reality is we all have the ability, like Moses, to find our way back to God and for God to use us just like he did for Moses. We've got to be open to take the climb back up to where God will meet us and encounter him so that we can be the conduits that God wants us to be. Moses was the conduit for God's freedom to be given to his people from Egypt. David was the conduit for God to use to get the resources to build God's temple so his son Solomon would only have to say, go, when it was time to build. And David had his own backsliding type moment when he committed adultery with Bathsheba and murder of her husband Uriah. But he also climbed back up and found his way to God. And we see the early church and the Jesus followers at the beginning, they were the conduit to each other when they gave to those who were in need, selling off what they had. We all can be conduits for God. We've got to learn that even when we slide down, when we backslide, when we have our struggles, all we got to do is climb back up to meet God. And when we meet God, he will choose to use us to be the conduits he can do things through.